As we begin, our question for discussion, I'm going to ask both of these. You can answer whichever one you prefer. If you had no obligations, money was not an issue, and you could do anything from your home, not necessarily in your home, but without moving for the next few months, how would you spend your time? Or what's your top bucket list experience that you would like to do and have not done?
As far as I'm concerned, I've had enough time at home. I want to get out and go somewhere.
You want to go out and go somewhere, so not spend time at home.
Sometimes I don't know what my bucket list is until something happens. And then I say, oh, that just happened, and that's a bucket list thing.
So sometimes there's not a bucket list until it happens, and then you realize that was a really good one.
Like walking down the beach with manatees. They're just, that's just,
Walking down the beach with manatees, as one does.
yes.
Yeah.
It was wonderful. And if I had money, and you could do everything from home now, I would buy a piece of property that I've been looking at for 40 years. And it is going to get swallowed up by development. And I would just like to keep it just the way it is. But they want $3 million for it, and I just don't have that right now.
Maybe
Well,
tomorrow.
search in your couch cushions for the 3 million, and maybe you can get that piece of property and keep
Right,
it
here's some
keep it
justice.
natural as it is. Yeah.
And also, one of the things not Bob doesn't want to go anywhere, but one of the things on our bucket list really was Alaska, and we are going to Alaska.
You're going to Alaska, going to see Alaska. That's
Good for
great.
you, because that's on my bucket list.
We ask those questions as we think about the things we would do if things weren't holding us back, maybe, or the things we dream of doing. We're going to talk a little bit about what we do and what maybe we don't do in our Bible study today, or at least how Peter talks about it. So we're going to turn to our passage, which comes from 1 Peter. And as a reminder, we're continuing on in a series on themes from the Reformation and Protestant movement. And today we're going to talk about calling and a concept called the priesthood of all believers. And if you don't know what that is yet, you hopefully will by the end of the study if we do our jobs today. Okay. So as a reminder, we have, I think just recently, well, at the beginning of the month, I don't know if we did this one in a Bible study or if I preached on this the week before the Bible study, but at the end of 1 Peter 1, there's a couple letters from Peter. This is the first letter we have from Peter, chapter 1. He talks about all flesh is like grass, and its glory like the flower of the grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of the Lord endures forever. We kicked off the Reformation series with the word. I don't think we did the Bible study on that. I think we started the next week, but we're picking up right after Peter says that. So we get to 1 Peter, and as a reminder, a lot of the epistles, the letters in the New Testament are written by Paul. 1 Peter is called 1 Peter because we attribute it to Peter, so the disciple Peter. And we're going to read chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Would somebody be willing to read 1 Peter chapter 2? Let's say we'll start with 1 through 5. Debbie, thank you.
Therefore, rid yourselves of all malice, deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. Like newborn babies, crave pure spiritual milk so that you may grow up in your salvation, now that you have tasted that the Lord is good. As you come to join him, the living stone, rejected by men, but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ.
That's good. Thank you, Debbie. Would somebody be willing to pick up from 6 through 12 for us? Thank you, Rick.
For in scripture it says, see, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone, and the one who trusts in him will never be put to shame. Now to you who believe, this stone is precious, but to those who do not believe, the stone the builders rejected has become the capstone, and the stone that causes men to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the message, which is also what they were destined for. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us.
Thank you, Rick. So actually, I jumped the gun here with the reading because we always start with the reading, but that's okay. My first question, what do you know about the responsibilities and functions of a priest in the Jewish faith in biblical times?
They probably were the only educated people, so they explained the Torah to explain the,
In Judaism, we have a high level of education, not just the priesthood.
okay.
But you're right that they teach, that's for
They
sure.
taught the Torah
Mhm.
to men.
There's the one.
Two men, thank you,
Yeah.
Pat. Yeah, probably more often than not. Yep, yep. What's the difference between the priests and the Pharisees? That's a great question, Donna. We can add the Sadducees in there too, the scribes. We hear about all these people. Anybody know?
Weren't the priests, they were born to be a priest, like they came down from
The Levites?
father to son to son to son.
What was? I was gonna say, Debbie, give me the name. Aaron. Yeah, yeah. So they're descendants of Moses's brother Aaron. They are Levites. They were born into it. You're right. You're right, Joyce. Yeah.
And they're the ones who maintain the temple all the way from taking care of it, providing the music, everything, going into the Holy of Holies. They were the keepers of the temple.
They're the temple staff in every way.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So they keep God's house, kind of.
Except in the sacrifices of the people at the times of year when sacrifices of the people came to Jerusalem, for example.
So we have two key differences now between Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, religious leaders, people who are experts in the faith, teachers, and the priests. The priests are born into it as descendants of Aaron. They are also the only ones who receive sacrifices and make sacrifices on the people's behalf. The Pharisees, Sadducees, Pharisees tended to be people who didn't relate to Rome. Sadducees tended to be people who did relate to Rome. The scribes were kind of the educated experts in the law. But the priests were the only ones who did the sacrifices. So not just the major festivals, but daily people brought sacrifices to the temple.
Was it that the priests couldn't be near a dead person? I'm trying to think. I don't know how to describe it, but they didn't do a funeral.
Right, they couldn't have been near a dead person because why would that be?
They would be unclean then.
And then what couldn't they do?
Then they couldn't go into the temple
Or make the sacrifices,
or make the
right?
sacrifices.
So it's not just because there was a purity thing, but it would have been stopped them from being able to do what they could do. Yeah, Jane?
Wasn't only one priest allowed to go into the Holy of Holies at a certain time of year, elected among the others?
So once a year, one priest could enter the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant is, which is the inner sanctum of God. So there's the one priest could represent the people
The Day of Atonement.
on the Day of Atonement. So yes, that's another function. So we've already answered two, who could be a priest too? There's part of that too. So in all of these things, what is it? So we've identified some of the tasks the priests do, what their responsibilities are, who they are. What's their function, does it seem like?
An intermediary between us and God.
They are intermediaries between us and God. This is a key understanding of what a priest does. And in fact, when we get into the Christian world and the Jewish world, the Latin word for priest is pontifex. We've heard of pontiff to describe a Catholic leader, right? Usually, I guess, the Pope. I'm not going to ask because I don't expect anybody to know what the word pontifex means. It means bridge builder.
So they're,
Intermediaries between the people and God.
Mhm.
So the very Latin word that comes to talk about this means bridge builder. So if you know Latin and you know that word, you think, oh, that's the essence of what a priest is supposed to be, as Rick has said. So these are important things to understand, not only historically what's going on, but then just kind of the function as we understand what this passage means or doesn't mean, okay? So now, Debbie.
I have a question, and I don't know, I hope I don't throw a whole monkey wrench in. But back in the Old Testament times, when you had the priests and they were in the temple, were there the Pharisees and Sadducees around then, or did they come after? Because I didn't realize until I was kind of looking into this, and kind of just went out of my head, that when the temple was destroyed, the priests were kind of no longer the keepers. There was nothing to be a keeper of anymore. So is that when the Pharisees came about?
So I have to express ignorance on some level here, Debbie, because I don't want to state things that I don't know fully. But
Okay.
as I understand it, you're onto something. The priests, the Pharisees, Sadducees, different leadership, they coexisted. They weren't all one group.
Right.
Pharisees, I don't think had to be born into it, Sadducees either. The Sadducees tended to be socially, economically elite. The Pharisees, not necessarily. These were just different political leaders within the religion. Whereas
Okay.
the priests, yes, they had political power too, but they were the religious leaders.
Right.
But what you just said, I think is correct. In as far as I know, that after the destruction of the temple, that the Pharisees become the forerunners of the modern rabbinical movement outside of the temple. So the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, are kind of the not descendants, the other way around, the ancestors of the modern rabbi. I don't think that's a perfect line,
Right.
but like what you said, the priests were tied to a specific place in a lot of ways too, I think. Whereas the Pharisees became the teachers and the ones who perpetuated the teaching in some way. So I don't know that every modern rabbi would say, yeah, I'm a descendant of a Pharisee, but the Pharisees are the teachers. So we sometimes look and see Pharisee bad guy, like it's like we're reading a drama and we know Pharisee is code for bad guy. I've been told that that's anti-Semitic even, that you're basically, you can't just say Pharisees are bad guys, because some within the Jewish tradition, if not a large majority, see them as the forerunners of the modern rabbinical movement. So to say the Pharisees are evil or bad would be undermining a lot of leadership. I can't say, I wish I had a rabbi friend to be able to speak to that question, because it's a really good one and I'd love to know a little bit more about it. But I think there's a nuanced understanding here that we need to think about when we're looking at Pharisees, that they are the ones who are trying to promote the law and how to live in it. And they are the ones who most often clash with Jesus because of that, because he's doing the same thing, right?
Right.
So with all that, this is all really important to understand a little bit of context here, because if we don't understand the function and the set apartness of priests, so priests are holy. Can anybody, we've talked about the word holy before. Anybody want to give me a definition of holy? Set apart. Good. Set apart. Usually we see holy and think halo. Not necessarily. Holy is set apart for a special purpose. And priests are the definition of holy in that matter. Not because they're perfect and pious, but because they have a special function within the people. So with understanding of priesthood and holiness, when we start to read this passage from Peter, we will realize how shocking it might sound. Not just to us today, but to those people back then. As you consider verses 1 through 3, so we're going to look at verse 1 through 3 in particular here. Rid yourselves therefore of all malice and all guile, insincerity, envy, and all slander. Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow into salvation, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. If all of us were to pursue these things, what would it look like? And number 4, what are some examples of things that people would stop craving?
Drugs and alcohol.
Drugs and alcohol, says Pat.
Because if we follow what these verses say, we have this heavenly lifestyle. So I don't think we're near that right now.
Pat says we're not necessarily near that right now. We don't, Peter speaks of almost a heavenly lifestyle. Yeah.
Instead of trying to be more like our neighbors, be more like Jesus.
Instead of being like our neighbors, more like the people around us,
Right.
we try and be more like Jesus. When you say that, Debbie, do you see that as some people compromising themselves to fit in, maybe?
Yeah, being envious of what other people have.
Oh, being envious of what other people have, yeah.
Social climbing, and that can lead to all sorts of, deceit, whatever, because
Deceit, yeah.
you could stab someone in the back just to make yourself look good for someone else. And so it's, our behavior can be atrocious at times.
What's that, Donna? Power grabbing.
Yes.
There'd be less of it.
There's a lot of lifestyle choices that wouldn't be there.
A lot of lifestyle choices too, yeah.
I said drugs and alcohol, but there are many more.
Yeah, yeah. People live for a lot of motivations that would be different, probably.
Yeah, would be very hard.
See, now mine says, be done with dishonesty and jealousy and talking about others behind their backs. So.
Yeah, I have slander, but talking about others behind their back is the essence of
And
slander.
That's pretty, I mean, if you got rid of that, I mean, things would be a lot different. I mean, it'd be a flip.
Even people who know they're not supposed to do the whole gossip and slander, it's still, well, I know it's wrong, but what'd you hear?
Well,
It's like, this isn't gossip, it's the truth. I know it's the truth, like, no,
Right.
that still
It's like,
counts.
You're afraid not to show up at the meeting because if you're not there, you're the one that gets talked
Yeah,
about.
so you got to show up at the meeting, right? Yeah.
Even the news is talking behind someone's back.
Oh, yeah. it's-
Or maybe to their face, but either way, it's news has become slanderous, right? It's always, Pat, in my opinion, the traffic accident. Everybody slows down to hear what's wrong.
Right.
But if you just say, well, I can't say that I'm a Democrat, but I agree with what President Biden said today. turn that channel. What's the point of that? You know, like, yeah, I want to hear what's wrong with what's going on. You know, oh, I'm not a Republican, but here's something good about Trump. Like, nah, I don't want to hear that. Tell me the bad things, you know? You're right. We feed off of that kind of stuff.
I don't really want to hear what actors and actresses have to say about politics, on and on.
Oh,
You name it.
oh, they're
I
the
mean,
worst.
that I will turn off.
Yeah, so in case that didn't get picked up for those at home, Pat says she doesn't really need to hear what actors and actresses have to say about politics or things like that. So yes, celebrity doesn't make you wise, right?
But isn't this totally human nature? I mean, this is part and parcel of what we are. It's our fiber. To get rid of that, you'd have to have a conversion.
So here's the interesting thing. You're right? It's part of the human condition. We call it sin. That can make us feel not so good about ourselves, but let's just be true about it. But the first couple words of this whole passage, rid yourselves. Peter's saying it's like you're wearing a bunch of clothing that's weighing you down. So he's saying, get rid of it.
But is it possible to get rid of this?
You're a monk, perhaps.
What?
Monks or nuns.
Monks, we're going to get to that point too. Hold on to that, Pat, because we're going to get to that. Can you rid yourself of it? That is the question, isn't it? And if you can, Peter doesn't have to write about this.
I
If
don't
it's
think-
easy.
yeah.
Sorry, Debbie.
I think we can try, but because we're not perfect, we will never 100% succeed.
Right, I agree.
So you're saying we might need grace in our lives? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes,
Okay, good.
grace,
I
mercy.
still have a job. Good, good. Yes, yeah.
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. Still need you up on the pulpit.
Still need me as an example of what not to do.
Grace.
Mom, I see a hand up at home. Unmute yourself, please. Mom, you're muted. Look of surprise.
Sorry, I didn't want to hear. It's almost as if he's encouraging us to sin boldly so that we'll know the difference of
Spin
being,
boldly so we know, okay.
yeah, so that we'll know if we're being righteous or not.
Have her explain that.
Yeah, have her explain that was the question. So where do you get that, Mom?
Well, he's listing all the things, malice, the guile, the insecurity, the envy, the slander. And then you begin to think, well, do I recognize it? So live boldly, and maybe if you're sinning, it will come around to hit you in the face, but you'll learn finally that you're being insincere and envious and all of that, because it's not giving you the kind of life that you really thought you wanted. It's like too much of anything.
So I might offer this, that I'm not sure that Peter encourages us to sin boldly. However, I think your statement is true that so often we don't understand we're doing it until we do it in a way that's really obvious. It's like, oh wow,
That's what I meant to say.
I was being insincere. Like, well, there was a lot of little insincerities that never really bothered me, but it was the big one. Now I understand what my problem is. So
Okay.
yeah. Let's move on here. What does Peter say about Jesus in verse 4? Go ahead, Jane.
That he is living stone
A living stone.
and chosen by God.
So he's chosen by God. He reinforces that. Living is a good word there, Jane, that there's still life there. What do you think he means that Jesus is a living stone? What would that language be about? And maybe we need to look at we need to use the following verses to understand that. That's okay.
Mine says living foundation of rock.
Foundation of rock.
So that makes more sense to me that, that hard foundation that you can stand on.
So not just that he's a stone, well, you say that about somebody you think is hard-headed or something, but this foundation, a stone in the sense that it's a foundation.
I think a church is built of stone or whatever, and Jesus is the church. So in a sense, he is the living church. He's the cornerstone. He is the basis of the church.
Foundation. So when we talk about it's a foundation for the church today. So this is going off script, but Debbie, based on what you said, Joyce, who's writing this and what do they have to do with stones?
Peter. Petrus is the rock.
So Peter's name is rock. Jesus says to him famously, on this rock I will build my church. And we don't know necessarily if he's saying Peter or his confession that Jesus is Lord. But Peter, Rocky, like I like to call him, he knows something about this stone language. He's thought about it for a while, right? That's his nickname.
Yeah. Okay.
Simon called Peter, called the rock. So interesting that he would be the one to talk about the living foundation, the living stone, right?
There's
So
a song, upon this solid rock I stand.
all other ground,
Sinking sand.
sinking sand.
All right.
Yeah,
I have something.
sure, Ari.
A note in my Bible said that furthermore, he is a life-giving stone.
A life-giving, not just living, but life-giving.
Yes.
Ari's wise, read the notes. Life-giving stone. So not just living, but living and giving life too. So then, how are we like Jesus, according to Peter, and what does that mean for us?
Are we like Peter?
How are we like Jesus?
Oh.
We're all living can live a personal relationship directly with God and not through a priest. You don't need an intermediary anymore between us and God. Stand face to face.
What gives you that idea in verse 5, Rick?
Into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices according to God's Christ. You also are living stones.
So if we are a priesthood, then going back to what we said about what priests do, we don't need a mediator for God anymore. We can have a direct connection with God.
And the curtain in the temple was torn upon Jesus' death, which opened up the Holy of Holies
Right.
to us all.
So Rick remembers in the story of the crucifixion on Jesus' death, the curtain of the temple is torn in two. The curtain separates the holy from the rest of the temple. It's as if God's dwelling place and ours now are one. And this priesthood of all believers continues to support that idea.
I think also as we walk our journey to come closer to Jesus and God, the more we work at that or whatever, the more we become one of the stones of the foundation. And we are now part of this foundation of the church along with Jesus, because that's what we're called to do, to go out and build more stones.
See, now mine says, and now you have become living stones for God's use in building his house.
Building stones for God's use in his house. So there's a lot of physical church kind of language, which is interesting because Peter did not live at a time where there were churches. And yet, we can apply his words maybe today, and especially when churches are built of stone or bricks. So let's say bricks, right? That's an easy image to get in our head, right? And especially Joyce, your language there, I love it. Could you repeat that again?
And now you have become living building stones.
Living building stones.
For God's use in building his house.
For God's use in building his house. So then, what does this have to say about priests and about monks and nuns? Mom raised her hand before Pat could answer.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, it just symbolically reminds me of the difference between a Catholic church and a Protestant in that they always have a confessional group that the priest listens to the confession of the parishioner. And in our Protestant churches, as far as I know, at least in the Reformed church tradition, we don't have a confessional booth because we can confess directly to God. And we have eliminated that priest because we are now a priesthood of believers ourselves.
So, yes. So one of the differences between the Catholic and Protestant tradition is that the Catholic tradition has confessional, where a priest hears confession. Now, the thing is, I just learned this, that there's a tradition within the Lutheran Church of confessionals too. Maybe not in the US, but definitely in the European Church, which I didn't know. The key difference is not just the confessional, because people come to the minister for confession all the time. The key difference is whether the priest can provide absolution. By that, what I mean is that the priest can say, if you do this, you will be forgiven. Right? So that's the priest's job, not just to hear the confession, but then to tell you how to be forgiven. We still, in a minister's role, in my priestly role as the leader of the church, I still hear confession, but it's not up to me to offer absolution. So that's where in a true Protestant understanding, that differs in a priestly role. So good point though, Mom. That is a key difference when people ask what's the difference as far as, are you a priest or a father or something like that? I'll say one of the differences, I don't provide absolution. Right, but I do hear confession, believe me, and it's good. It's good to have somebody to talk to about that. A lot of ministers have coaches, they call them now, but basically they're confessors, as they would have been called in medieval times. I see Joyce and then Ari.
Yeah, because mine goes on to say, from this, what's more, you are his holy priests. So come to him, you who are acceptable to him because of Jesus Christ. So he's saying we have become,
There's no need for a mediator anymore.
we're the priests.
Right, we're the priests in that function, in that way.
I mean, somehow that role has been, given.
Offer spiritual sacrifices, one translation says, we heard earlier. So now the priestly role of offering sacrifices on behalf of the people, we can offer ourselves. Paul in Romans chapter 8 says, offer yourselves as holy and living sacrifices. Same kind of idea, that we present ourselves as a sacrifice, not killing ourselves, but we offer ourselves to God. Ari.
Going back to the, when you said there was no churches in Peter's day, would that be meaning that God's house, or would the spiritual house would be in a metaphorical sense?
Yeah, so for those at home, Ari asked, when I say there's no churches in Peter's day, does that mean we're talking about church in a metaphorical sense? I think, yeah. So when I say that, I mean, we're really early in the people met in people's homes.
Yeah.
So they're not building a church out of stone or something like we'll see years to come. So yes, I think it's a metaphorical sense that all of us become pieces of the larger. They could look at buildings and understand this. They just weren't necessarily just built to be a church like there are today, right? But let me get back to Pat. You mentioned monks and nuns, and this is something that when you take that idea and put it even further, there's been a Christian tradition since the beginning of people who set themselves apart and go live in the desert. So now monks and nuns tend to live in community, actually, in very intentional ways. So I don't want to just say this is what I'm talking about, because really I'm not. I'm talking about people who go to live their lives separate from others. What do you think Peter would say about that? The wider question, can you be a Christian by yourself?
Peter might say, I don't know what Peter would say, definitely.
Chris, what about the Desert Fathers?
One second, Dick.
Yeah, okay.
Live that way, but you also have some kind of calling from God that you have to fulfill in the broader Christian body.
So Pat says you can withdraw to a certain extent, but you also have a calling to fulfill in the broader Christian body. Dick says, what about the Desert Fathers, which is this movement in the first few hundred years of Christianity and later, where people withdrew into the desert. So Dick, what about the Desert Fathers? What do you think that they did? What do you think Peter would say to them?
I think he would be not strongly against it, but point out that what they're doing was not filling the role that they should be doing, which is going nuts. This was a process of being alone in the desert. Maybe the better thing to do is go out and tell the people, this is what Jesus is saying to you. You know, that process continues. So we're not just being infantilized by the group out there in the desert, which I've read, and they're really beautiful. They're all really beautiful messages. But I somehow think they're missing the boat. That's the end of my.
So no, good idea, Dick. This is one of the things we think about, right? So Pat in person and then mom at home. Pat?
One of my very favorite people, Barbara Cullum, used to call it navel gazing.
Navel gazing.
You are just consumed with yourself and
Consume with yourself.
and you need to go out and do outreach.
So instead of just being focused inward to be outward too. Mom? Yes, mom and
Okay,
home.
well, I think it's important that we look at what Jesus did, because he did go off, or tried to go off to be by himself when the movement got so big that he couldn't ever be by himself, and he needed time to be with God and to refocus, or just with his disciples. And I think we all need time to do self-introspection, but then we have to be part of a bigger community. And it's sometimes very hard to know, like I'm alone a lot, and I know I really miss being more with people. That's especially due to COVID, which is still at the rampage out here. But I think Jesus was a good example of separating and trying to get back to your true self and what your relationship to your
So you bring up a good point, that there's a difference between going to live your life in a desert and taking some time for introspection and then living in community.
Right.
So let me tie up this point and then we'll go on to say that you cannot be a rock that is part of the building of a church if you are a rock by yourself.
Right. You're not a living stone.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think of all the bricks that make up a wall, if we're to be part of that wall, if we're to be part of that foundation, we cannot be a brick alone. So I don't mean to say the Desert Fathers were wrong, like Dick, I say they're inspiring. They have a lot of inspiration for people, but unless you interact then with others and show what you've learned, unless you take your time for introspection and then share your learnings, you're just a brick or a rock out in the desert. And you have no chance to be a living foundational stone, which is something that Peter offers us, which in some ways is awesome. In some ways that is scary to think that that is our task. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. We're going to skip actually down to number 9 here and 10. What does verse 9 tell us about what? So Peter quotes then Isaiah 28, Psalm 118, and Isaiah 8. I've listed the references there if you want to take a look at them at some other time. But right now, we're just going to look down at verse 9. This is question number 10. What does verse 9 tell us about what God has done and will do? And what about what we are called to do?
Chris, my Bible says that the reference to in verse 9, God's own people meet, a people for his possession. Whether that's illuminating or not, but it's like he wants this people, this group of people to be his and to fulfill his work on earth.
So God has chosen us.
We're to praise him.
We're to praise God, which is worship, that really is worship. That's the whole essence of worship, is to offer God praise for God's claim on us.
And in
Go ahead,
my
Jane.
Bible, verse 9, the important word, but you.
But we what, Jane? What do we have to do?
He's given us information beforehand and examples, and then said, but you are chosen. And this is how you live, must live.
Yeah, so because of these things, because Jesus is a living stone, we are part of the stones also. We can do this as well. So then now, we're called to what?
Go out and be the light, be examples of Jesus, spread his word.
See, mine says that we are called, says, for you have been chosen by God himself. You are the priests of the king.
We're the priests of the king.
You are holy and pure. You are God's very own.
God's very own.
All this is so that you may show others how God called you out of the darkness.
All this is so that you can show how God called, so you can show others how God called you out of the darkness. My translation, Joyce, in this one says, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of the darkness into his marvelous
Mine says
light.
into the light. Yeah, mine says.
How then are we functioning as a priest?
We're preaching, just like they taught the Torah, we're teaching, we're at least showing an example of God's word
We're trying to help connect
for the bridge.
God, right. So, not in a way that we have to always be a barrier between people and God, but now that there is no barrier between us and God, we then are to live to show people that that is the case.
So we become the bridge.
We
really.
become priests in every way. And not only now that there needs to be no mediator, but now our job is to then connect, to be bridge builders ourselves.
Interesting. It's impossible.
That's impossible. Well, I don't want to get into Congress and appropriations for infrastructure, but as that is a conversation now, we might think about how we want to shore ourselves up as bridges. What work do we need to do on ourselves to make sure that we continue to be a bridge, that other people can see God, that we can share that light? I guess that should have been the sermon. Oh, well, we'll have to think of something else for Sunday. Now that we said it out loud, that's a good one, right? How do we shore ourselves up so we can continue to be that bridge? Study, yeah. Prayer.
Get rid of all this other stuff that we're supposed to do back in.
Get rid of all the other stuff we were supposed to get rid of back in verse 1 and 2. Carol, I see your hand.
Yes,
Can you hear me or?
Yes, I can. We can.
Okay, it says, God be God's instruments to do his work and speak out for him, telling others of night and day the difference he made for you.
So share the difference God made for you. That's the Message translation, a good help for us to understand things in different language there.
In a sense, giving or sharing our testimonies on how we've been touched by God.
Sharing testimonies on how we've been touched, what difference God has made in our lives, right?
Right. And that, because I've always had like a fear, like, oh, I don't know enough about the Bible. I can't go out and, stand on the street corner and talk things, whatever. But I've learned no one can argue your testimony because it's personal.
Yeah.
You're not quoting the Bible or doing whatever. You're talking about you, and they cannot argue it.
So Debbie brings up a good point for those, in case you didn't hear that. Sometimes we always feel, well, I'm not an expert in these things. I don't want to be the one to share it in case I do it wrong or, somebody challenges me. But when it's our personal story, people can't challenge that. So Debbie, for better or worse, that's my theory on preaching. For better or worse, that's why you hear personal stories in my sermons.
Right.
Because I think when you add in your own, this is what I learned, or this is where I got it wrong, I think that always makes more connection to me than just saying, well, the Bible says, and theologian so-and-so said, yeah, but tell me why it matters for you so I can understand why it mattered for me.
It brings it on a personal level.
Because once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Tell me what that means to you in your life so I can understand what it means to me in mine.
And see, I don't like to be preached to. You know what I think the average person they don't like that being preached to. I think it's much better as an individual to show, like you said, live your faith, and people will see through how you live, how your faith has drawn light,
So Joyce, I've heard from people that different seminaries in our tradition teach preaching differently. And that if you can tell where the preacher is trained by listening to the sermon, if they preach at you, they definitely went to one of these seminaries. If they preach to you or better with you, then you learned preaching at a different seminary. So preaching to someone is one thing, preaching with them, including yourself in the sermon,
right.
That's testimony, right? Debbie, going back to what you said, Joyce, I think that most of us get a lot more out of that than hearing somebody preach at us. Because preaching at you, you always have to consider the source. Preaching with you, yeah, I am part of the source here. I'm part of the priesthood, right? Because preaching at people, I feel like, removes them from being part of the priesthood. It kind of goes against what we're saying here, that I'll tell you what to do. Well, no, we're all together in this, right? So in our tradition, we have something called the parity of office, which means the minister of word and sacrament, the elders and the deacons, they all work together on an even footing. So I might be ordained as a minister, but we're all part of the priesthood of believers. That's built into what we believe. And it's not just a theological concept. We can all hear, right? What does that mean for us? We've heard the function. So let's then look at number 11, using verses 11 and 12, summarize what Peter calls us to do, knowing what he shared with us in the verses prior to this one. He adds a really interesting part at the very end here. Paul, I can see you have something ready to say.
Well, we should be a shining example in the darkness, really. We're immersed in the darkness.
Be a shining example within the people around us, within darkness be a light.
Referred to as pagans in my translation.
Yeah.
We're among that.
Yeah.
We're.
Mine says Gentiles. Either way, people who do not believe, people who are not followers of God, we're supposed to be a light in the midst of all of that.
Even though people might ridicule us.
Yeah, Chris, it's almost like changing your verbal, you should do this, you should do that, you should do this, to, you know, stopping the shoulding on other people and just trying to exemplify how you believe you ought to be living in relationship to your understanding of the scripture and who God has become, who God is through others in you. You know, I look at each of you and think, what can I learn from them because of their experiences that aren't my experiences?
So here we have, just kind of to wrap up, in that day and age, you have to remember there's a lot that's not known about Christians and a lot of misunderstanding. So one, there's a rumor that Christians are cannibals. When they eat the Lord's Supper, there was something about eating the flesh of others. That was a rumor that some people believe. There's definitely a rumor that they're home wreckers, because if you became a Christian, you necessarily may have left your home to come and follow this movement, because you can't still be a part of that and a part of this at the same time. There's a rumor that they're insurrectionists, that they won't be loyal to Caesar. So what does Peter say? They're going to say these things about you. Don't argue with them. Show them the truth. Make your life the testimony. Preach to them. Don't use words. Be that shining light among people who don't believe. Show them what it means to be a believer. Be a living foundational rock that they can stand on. You know, we talk about standing on the shoulders of others. Be the shoulders that others can stand on, because they've learned it from you. So we sum up, what does it mean to be a part of God's royal priesthood? I leave you with that. I think we've talked a lot about that. But go ahead, Pat.
I was just gonna say, and it may not be an answer for us. How did the Catholic Church take this and turn it into the Catholic Church with a priest and saints?
How did Christians take this and create a system of hierarchy that eventually becomes the Roman Catholic Church? A good question. So we can see why people like Luther and Calvin and others before them and many others after say, yeah, that doesn't jive with what we're trying to go back to biblical mandates here. And we don't see that structure here, right? So you're right, Pat, that as Protestants, we can look at it and say, well, that doesn't seem to jive. I would imagine that people versed in Catholic doctrine and theology would be able to answer those questions better than I, but that's why I'm a Protestant, because I see this and think, yeah, that's what it means for me. That's what it means for all of us, right? So I leave with a question for reflection here. I recently read an interview with an employee from IKEA who explained that as people have come back to shopping after pandemic shutdowns, they seem ruder and more entitled than ever. The speaker explained how customers seem quicker to treat employees as lower than them and to argue with employees about supply and product shortages, demanding products right away, even if the employee has no control over that. I wonder if life is getting harder or less convenient for many of us, and this is how sometimes we respond, by lashing out at others. What might Peter say to us about this as we experience difficulty in life? Both the employees who take it from customers and customers who aren't getting what they want right away. Is life supposed to be easier for God's people? I just leave you with that as a question for reflection. Thanks so much, all my fellow priests, for participating today. I hope that this stirs some things in you, and hope it was edifying. Next week we get to justification. That's kind of the capstone to all of our Reformation understanding. And just as a pitch, on the 31st, on Reformation Sunday, when we celebrate the anniversary of when Luther nailed his 95 Theses into the doors, which Lisa Riccozzi is going to have our kids do on a door here we're gonna have a lot of safety measures in place apparently, so. But I'm gonna offer a workshop after church on some of the history of Reformation movements and how we got into the RCA, what that is and how we got here. So we've talked about a lot of the theology and thinking behind the Reformation. We're gonna talk a little bit more about the history of it, about 40 minutes or so of workshop after worship on the 31st. So thanks everybody for joining us. Folks at home, thanks for joining us today. Hopefully you could hear and everything. It sounds like you could because you were jumping in when we did it. I got a new mic that you might be able to see there. So hopefully that is picking all of us up a little bit better. But we'll hope to see everybody again next week.
Next week.
Thank you.
Take care.
Here.